I have 10 things to tell you. They're all important. I'm going to tell them to you one at a time, starting with number 1. That's what Moses did when he looked at the laws that he had written, over 600 commandments. He narrowed it down to 10 that would represent them all. 10 important commands. But even then, he couldn't say them all at once. That would be meaningless. He had to line them up in order, 1 through 10, and tell them to us one at a time. But some commandment had to be the number 1, the one that got it all started. Well, Moses chose well. The first commandment says, "You are to have no other gods before me, says the Lord your God." Now that's a good statement because it fits so well what the scriptures teach. There's only one God. Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 4 emphasizes, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." There is only one God that exists. Now which God is that? Moses said, it's the one who created the heavens and the earth. Anything less than that is not really a God. It's the one who brought you out of Egypt and delivered you. Anything less than that is not really a God. There's only one God. And Moses explains to his people, you never want to offend the one true God by associating with any of the other so-called gods. The people of the world will create deities that they worship. We stay away from them. We focus on the one true God. This brings us back then to Leviticus chapters 18, 19, and 20, and to a section I call the foreign God rules. The rules that tell us not to be part of the foreign gods of this world. Now, those rules were for Moses and his people, but they're still relevant today. The God situation hasn't changed at all. There's still only one God, and he still gets easily offended by those who don't give him the honor he deserves. But I'll also remind you of the Jerusalem Council, Acts chapter 15, that gathering of the apostles, the elders of the church of Jerusalem, other church leaders. They looked at the whole law of Moses. They determined there were 3 sets of rules we're still going to emphasize in the Christian faith. One set of rules, the porneia rules, no sexual immorality. We've studied that in Leviticus. Second set of rules, the blood, the slaughtered meat rules. We're still holding to that. We've talked about those. And now we come to a third set of rules they chose to keep, the foreign God rules. Now, the foreign God rules in essence are this. We don't believe, we don't practice, we don't associate, we don't imitate. We don't believe what the peoples of this world believe about their deities. And we're not going to practice the rituals they do. We're not going to associate with the things they do. We're not going to imitate the things that they do. Now, Leviticus gives us a case in point. Chapter 18, verse 21, do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech. We're talking about a child sacrifice to a foreign god. The penalty in Leviticus 20 would be stoned to death if a Jew were to do such a thing. Now that's wrong for so many reasons. First, no respect for the sanctity of human life in general, but more particularly, it doesn't show a care and concern for the well-being of the children whom you're responsible for. But on a greater level, it's wrong because it offends the one true God. And thus the bottom line is, we don't participate in any sacrifices and rituals for foreign gods. It offends the one true God. Also in Leviticus chapter 19, here's another rule. Don't practice divination. Don't seek omens. Don't turn to mediums. Don't seek out spiritists. Now, this is going to get us into a set of things that Moses will give later in Deuteronomy 18. It's a broader list of prohibitions. It tells us don't go seeking the strange powers that are offered in other religious faiths. They have powers that they offer you from their deities. We say no to those powers. We're not interested. He says in Deuteronomy 18, don't imitate the detestable ways of the nations that I'm driving out of the land that I'm giving you. For example, the power that they offer to try to read the future. Don't let anyone be found among you who practices divination or interprets omens. Or when they offer the power to cast spells, don't let anyone be found among you who practices sorcery or witchcraft or cast spells. Or when they offer an opportunity to speak to the spirit world, to talk to the dead, don't let anyone be found among you who is a medium, a spiritist, one who consults the dead. Those kind of things are wrong for many reasons. Certainly, if someone is a fraud and just pretending he's got this power, it's wrong for you to let yourself be conned by him. But even if the person has a genuine power, remember the power is not from God, because he told you to stay away, and it's not from these other gods, because they don't really exist. As the scriptures will explain, if there's a real power there, it's probably the power of demons. You don't want any part of that at all. But it's wrong on an even higher level, because by going to these other practices of these other faiths and drawing from their powers, you have offended the one true God. You put your trust in him and him alone. Give you another rule from Leviticus, a strange one it may sound. He says, do not cut the sides of your hair. Cut, cut, cut. Don't cut the edges of your beard. And don't put cuts on your body. Don't put markings on yourself. Now, a lot of times Christians will quote this passage and they'll say the rule is against tattoos. And that's especially handy if you've got someone in your family who's got tattoos you don't like. You just quote this passage and it sounds good, but it's a wrong understanding of the text. This is not a rule against tattoos. You see, Moses wasn't dealing with what we today do as cultural body art. Like it or not, that's not his issue. What Moses was addressing was pagan religious rituals, particularly the rituals they used for the dead. That's what he says in the text. It's their funeral rituals. You can go to Deuteronomy 14. He'll tell you more about these rituals for the dead. I like particularly, though, what Jeremiah describes. Jeremiah chapter 48, centuries later, we're still preaching to the Jews, stop imitating what these pagans do at their funerals. He describes them this way. They're in their sackcloth, and yet they're taking their knives and they're cutting cuts into their hair and into their beard. They're slashing their hands. You see, that's what they did as their rituals in order to get the attention of their deities. It's like the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings chapter 18. When they're trying to pray to their God to send down fire, it says they took knives and they began to cut themselves. It's the bloodletting and the scarring that comes from that. That's the markings of the skin, the scars. We were told from Moses, we don't imitate the practices of the false religions. The things they do that are distinctive to their religion and their practice, we don't do those things. Because remember, we don't do anything that suggests an association with the foreign gods. We don't want people to think that we even condone such things, let alone that we're part of it. So remember, we don't believe, we don't practice, we don't associate, we don't imitate the things that go on with the foreign gods. Now, it's those teachings of Moses that influence Paul as he explains the rules about eating food sacrificed to idols. Now, the Jerusalem Council just simply said, tell the Gentiles don't eat food sacrificed to idols. Paul will later, in 1 Corinthians, give that an elaboration. He'll put more details to it, explain it a little bit better. Here's what Paul taught. Paul says in 1 Corinthians that in principle, you can eat anything you want. Any food is clean and any food can be eaten, and that includes foods sacrificed to idols. They're safe because, after all, the gods they were sacrificed to aren't real. The rituals don't actually contaminate the meat at all. So here's Paul's rule. First, you can eat meat that's been sacrificed to an idol in ignorance. That is, all you know is you've been invited to dinner at someone's house. They serve you steak. You don't have to ask, where'd this meat come from? No, don't ask questions. Just eat and enjoy. Now, he also says you can eat not only in ignorance, but you can eat with awareness. You can eat meat that you know was sacrificed to an idol. As long as you and everyone else at the table, this is not an issue. It's a gathering of believers who, like Paul, don't think this is an issue at all. Then you've got no problem. Enjoy your steak. Now, also, he says, but make sure your conscience is clear, that you feel comfortable doing this, because if not, then don't eat it. Now, when would you not eat meat sacrificed to an idol? Paul says, don't eat it if it compromises your witness. If the issue arises, this meat was given in a sacrifice to such and such a god, and that puts you in a position of eating and suggesting an association or an acceptance of that deity, then say no to the steak. So that was the key. The key was we don't do anything that associates us with foreign gods. We don't do anything that compromises our witness for our one true God. We don't do anything that offends the Lord. This brings us to an end then of our study of Leviticus chapters 18 through 20. It's a challenging passage because it goes back to ancient times, rules that sometimes have to be brought into a more modern way of understanding so we know what to do with them. But it's very practical rules that help us with holy living. Moses taught us about social ethics, how to interact with one another. He gave us sexual ethics, how to stay sexually pure and not get into porneia, immorality. And he taught us about respect for sacred things. Moses reminds us that we have been called by God to be different from this world. We have a different faith. We have different behavior and conduct. We have different values. And the difference is for the better, because God's trying to show us a better way to live, the holy way, as he calls it. And thus you want to remember the teaching of Moses, the teaching of Leviticus, that will guide us in our day-to-day life. We're to be different, be better, be holy.